Hello, my name is Andrew Meers, and today I'm going to be demonstrating inlay, both raised and flush inlays. I'm going to set a circle and a square in steel, as well as other two different types of wire inlay. First, I'm going to lay out the shapes I'm using. Today I'm using copper and silver. I'm going to mark it out, in this case, with a Sharpie and a scribe. I'm going to scribe around the circle, and then I'm going to proceed to cut the circle out of the copper. The pieces are then scribed out onto steel plate, and that will give me an area for which I can carve a little space for which the metal can fit into. For the line, I'm just going to mark it out with a ruler and scribe. Now I'm just cutting out the shapes with a jeweler's saw. I'm going to clean up the shape with a file, and I'm actually going to try to leave a slight angle, bevel on the edge, so that the material is no longer square, and it'll help me set the piece of metal into the inlay slot I cut. I'm going to go ahead and anneal all the pieces, including the wire. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to heat it up to a dull red and plunge it in water. So I'm selecting all the chisels I need for the inlay, and then I'm going to go ahead and sharpen those. I use a Spyderco sharpening stone. And fortunately, because it's usually for such small scale work, I don't need to do too much honing, but I'll go ahead and sharpen everything before I work on a long project. This is a little tricky to see, but sharpening will aid in your ability to cut and remove the metal. I think the most notable thing I do is I polish the cutting edge at the finishing stone so that the scratch pattern is perpendicular to the cutting face. So that gives you a more clean cut when you're chiseling. Next, I'm going to take a heat gun and heat up the thermoplastic. The thermoplastic is used to hold the workpiece, and I have mine set to a plastic pipe cap, which can be acquired at a hardware store, and I use it to hold the plastic and then hold the piece in the vise. I'm going to lightly sand some of the copper, some of the fire scale off, as well as the silver. Now that I have my pieces laid out and set in the plastic, I'm going to go ahead and follow the line I've scribed onto the metal. I'm going to cut around the circle first, and then I'm going to remove the background area so that the copper fits into that recessed area. Then I'm going to use several different types of chisels to drive up the edge of the circle in a burr, and that metal will then be folded back onto the copper piece, and that's similar to how a bezel setting is created. To drive up the burr at the edge of the circle, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can use a chisel and follow along the line, just move in a linear fashion, tracing the line. Or you can start the chisel in a little from the line and drive the chisel to the outside of the line, and that will also raise up a burr. You just have to make sure you connect the burr or the inlay won't sit well in the slot you created. Something to be noted is I'm holding the chisel in a way that can be seen a little better by the camera, but normally I would fold all my fingers underneath the chisel and drag the chisel directly towards me instead of canting my hand off to the side. I've chosen a chisel to remove the background material, and what I'll do is I'll trace around the outside of the circle with the line I just cut, and then I'll continually chisel away until I've connected the circle. You have to be careful not to hit the edge of the burr. I wound up doing that at one point, and what I'll do is come back in and drive the burr back up again and remove the material from inside the circle. Now I'm just going to work the chisel in straight lines and remove as much material as I can, I'll constantly rotate the piece and adjust it so I can maximize the area I'm able to remove. Now that the background is removed, I'm just going to come back in and try to adjust it to make sure it's as flat as possible on the bottom of the circle. And I'm fixing this area where I ruined the burr, so I'm just digging down a little further with the chisel. Not doing too much, just subtly removing some more area, and then I want to come back in and with the next chisel drive the burr back up a little. So now I'm using a different chisel. It kind of looks like a horse's hoof, and I'm coming in again and driving up that burr on the area that I've already removed. And this again will help the inlay sit into the slot, as well as leave some material I can fold over the inlay. I'm just double checking to make sure that the circle fits into the area I've removed. So now I'm going to remove the area for the square. It's pretty much the same process. I'm going to be using chisels that are squared off at the ends and have sharper corners to make sure I can keep all those lines crisp. I'm using a scraper here after checking the fit with the square, and I'm making sure I use a hand scraper to remove some material from the corners so that I can keep those nice and clean. And when I'm using the scraper, I'm using my thumb as a brace and sort of leveraging it against my thumb and scraping away from myself. So I'm checking the fit on the copper circle. Some of the areas have slight gaps and some of the areas is a little too close, but I think overall it's a good fit, and I'll start to set the copper. I'll start to set the burr, and it's similar to changing a tire. I'll knock down on opposite sides of the burr first. I'll tap the burr over a little and then set little points, and once I get it secure enough, I'll go ahead and trace the outside of the circle with the chisel. And this chisel is sort of shaped like a fuller. It's very small, it's only about a few millimeters wide, but it's rolled over and rounded. I'll go ahead and use chopsticks to set the metal in without hitting it, and that way I don't have to re-anneal the metal. And I'm using a flat chisel to set down the edges of the copper, and this will help seat the metal underneath the burr and allow for a better set. I'm just adjusting the outside of the burr and making sure it matches level with the background of the steel. And I'm going to use a flat chisel to clean up the outside edges around the circle to make sure it's as flush as possible. And I'm using a scraper here to clean up the surface of the copper again. Same technique, I sort of use my thumb as a stop and scrape away from my thumb. This square is very similar. I use the chopstick to set it in and then tap over the burr. This one's a flush setting, so I've carved out the background a little deeper. And when I flatten it down, I'll try and make sure I set it in a little further. I'm removing a little corner of the steel that popped up, and then flattening the metal down into the slot I've cut. For the flush inlay on the square, I'm just going to clean it up a little bit with a file first, and then use a scraper to clean off the high spots. And I'll clean up the edges around the side with a scraper on the round piece as well. Now I'm inlaying a few silver lines into the copper circle. I'll use a square fine chisel to cut the slots, and then I'll set silver wire into them. I've cut some lines in the copper now. I'm just using another flat chisel that's a little wider to undercut the edges of the line. And this will help the silver stay inlaid into the copper. Just measuring out the silver wire and adjusting the slots I've cut. I'll clip the wire I've marked and set it in with tweezers. I'll use chopsticks to get it roughly lined up. And then I'll use that flat chisel to set the material down. I give it a pretty light tap to get it tensioned. Then I'll just work the chisel and follow the line down towards myself. And once again, I'll use a file and a scraper to clean up the line. So now I'll clean the piece up with files and sandpaper, and I'll give it a little planishing with the flat chisel and refile and resand the piece. So now I'll do the line inlay in both raised and flush. I'll use a chisel that sort of looks like a double beveled obelisk from one side, and I'll give it a strong tap vertically and then do long passes towards myself. And again, I usually curl my fingers underneath the chisel, but to give a little bit more visibility, I've got them draped over the piece. Now that the line is cut, I'm going to undercut the side walls with the same flat chisel. And then I'm going to score the bottom of the trough I've created with little burrs made with a tiny flat chisel. And then I'm just going to measure the wire and clip it. And I've left myself a little extra so I can hang on to it with tweezers, just in case. Use a flat chisel and tap it down till it's firmly seated, and then I'll draw the chisel towards myself. And when I get close to the end of the slot, I'll take out a flat cutting chisel and score this silver wire and then just peel it off. And then I'll proceed to set the wire with the flat chisel again, and I'll take a pass in the opposite direction. And then I'm just gonna clean up the area outside the wire with another flat chisel. And take another pass with the flat chisel and then burnish the surface of the wire. The process is pretty much the same for the flat inlay. Cut a slot, score the edges and the bottom, and I'll just set the silver in the same way, but the line slot is a little bit deeper, and I'll use the flat chisels on top to make it more flush with the steel and scrape it flatter. I'll just, again, use a scraper by leaning against my thumb and pushing it away to go ahead and clean that piece up. Now I'm going to patina the pieces to bring out the contrast between the fine metal and the steel. I'm using a parkerizing solution to make the background black, and that will contrast with the fine metal. I make sure I wash the piece, and then I put it in the solution for a few minutes, and then I just clean it off with a little Windex. I had to scrape back all the solution that got caught on the silver wire. But as you can see, the contrast between the fine metal and the background's quite stark, and that's what I really like about fine metal inlaid in the steel, is you can really have a nice deep black and that contrast with the different hues of fine metal. And you can actually patina over the fine metal with other patinas like roksha or liver of sulfur after the steel is blackened. And thanks for taking the time to let me share with you a little of how I do the inlays. It's difficult to see a lot of the cutting edges of the chisels, but you can find some of them online or in engraving forums. And please feel free to reach out to me with any questions you may have. Instagram is probably the best way to get in touch with me. Thanks again.